In the last module, we talked quite a bit about progressivism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what we're going to talk about today happens simultaneously. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind as we're discussing American imperialism in the Spanish-American War and its effects really for the United States. Probably one of the least known wars, but something that really has a major effect in the United States, both domestically and internationally. So let's go ahead and start talking about it. To put this really into context, imperialism was something that was happening all over the world at this time. So a lot of European countries, you think about Europe, okay, Europe is very small, and so it needed more resources, right? It needed to expand, and so it starts to look to imperialize other countries, develop colonies. You may remember from your world history classes, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that was really because there was never a place on the planet that where the sun didn't shine that the British Empire didn't have some kind of control over. And so America gets involved in this kind of game, and the justification morally for taking over other areas was something known as white man's burden, right? That they were Christianizing, bringing civilizations to these uncivilized savages. And so we're going to see a lot of debates on this. And here in the United States, there was quite a bit of debate, especially with the progressives too, over this idea of imperialism. But I just want to give in context why America really was imperializing. So we really began, in the late 1890s, and we kind of see the Western Hemisphere as our zone, as our sphere. So that's going to play a role into what we do in the United States. Also, you need to remember and keep in perspective, too, that we had already completed Manifest Destiny from coast to coast. So if we are going to expand, and America is big, right, especially compared to European countries physically, and so we have a lot of natural resources. More of what American imperialists, pro-imperialists will look for is for an expansion of markets to sell to, okay, and products, but mostly markets, whereas in Europe, they're searching for more of the products than they are the markets necessarily. Okay. All right. So just to let's kind of put together these two terms so that you understand what they are. So imperialism is essentially when a more powerful country takes completely over and controls another country. A sphere of influence is basically what happened to China in the late 1800s and what really causes the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. And essentially what that was a country has so much control over a less powerful country. It controls so much that it has major economic and political and even social influence on that country. And so that's essentially what happens to China, where it, with the European countries, where they can divide it up, they take ports at that time, so they have a sphere of influence over parts of China, which again is going to cause, the Chinese people to be very unhappy about foreign influence, and what's going to lead to the Boxer Rebellion. Even though it's overthrown, it plants the seeds for communism that takes over in 1949. So all of this is really, really interrelated, something you need to know. Also to keep back in your mind and context is that in 1867, shortly after the Civil War, America purchased Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million. Now at the time, the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named William Seward, he purchased this, and he was laughed at for purchasing this because they're like, why would we want this enormous iceberg in Alaska or by Russia? Why would we pay that kind of money? So it was nicknamed Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and the poor guy dies not realizing the real worth of Alaska. And in 1896, gold is found in Alaska. This launches the Klondike Gold Rush, and of course, no longer it's considered Seward's Folly. But again, he had passed away before that, and he didn't realize that. Okay, another thing that happens during this time is that there's a very influential book that's published by an ex-Navy admiral by the name of Albert Thayer Mann. And essentially what it said was that in order for America to become a real economic and political power, it needed to build up its navy, create naval bases all around the world, okay? And they needed a big navy to be able to do that, and also to imperialize in order to really become a political and economic powerhouse. And so a lot of people look at this book as like the manual. It looks back on history of why the Navy is so important and why countries are running the world at that time. And so America really looks to this book as kind of a how-to book, so that becomes very influential. Also at this time, it's important to note that Americans, mid-1800s about, really had started to trade and interact with Hawaii, which they called the Sandwich Islands at that time. And they had a strong sphere of influence over Hawaii itself. But there was a king who died, and his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, I think I pronounced that right. Anyway, she takes over, and she champions Hawaii for Hawaiians and wants to throw out the Americans. This causes the American businessmen that were there at the time to overthrow her and launch this whole overthrow of her. And it's actually annexed 5 years later. That when the queen is overthrown, Grover Cleveland was president at the time, and he didn't like this, and he actually tried to give back Hawaii to Hawaiians, but he didn't win because he was not, the Congress didn't agree with him at that time. But in 1898, when a man named William McKinley became president, he was a major pro-imperialist, and so that's when we annexed Hawaii. There's a video clip that you should really watch on this. It's super fascinating into Hawaiian history and how that really happens. Okay. The other major thing that happens at this time is that in Cuba, which is I think only 90 miles south of the Florida Keys, so it's physically very close, it was controlled by Spain. It was a Spanish colony. But there was a big push for the Cubans to have their independence from Spain, and this comes from the Cubans, but Americans are literally pushing the Cubans into this, mainly because, okay, here's the real reality of it. Americans had been eyeing Cuba for a long time. The American Southerners in particular really wanted Cuba as a southern colony, as a southern sugar colony. It never comes to fruition. But in the late 1800s, when there's a lot of discontent by the Cubans there, American businessmen are really pushing for the Cubans to, overthrow their Spanish colonizers. And so, what happens, one of the reasons why this does happen is because there are two newspaper journalists that really push and for lack of better terms, fake news of the time, called yellow journalism. And it really exaggerates what's happening there in Cuba and what's happening to the Cubans. And the reason it was nicknamed yellow journalism is because that was the ink they used to make this yellow kid that was really propaganda against the Spanish. Also at the same time, there was a Spanish ambassador by the name of Delome, and he wrote a letter that was intercepted that was supposed to go to, to Spain, to the Spanish government, and basically called McKinley weak. And that was a huge critique of him, that he catered to the rabble, and that was like a 19th century burn. And so of course, Pulitzer and Hertz, and yes, the Pulitzer Prize is named after him. Hertz Publishing, they own most of the newspapers in the United States, including the San Antonio Express News. But anyway, they publish this newsletter, so this kind of adds to the whole propaganda against the Spanish at the time and against their rule. And here's an image of, it's highly racist, by the way, all this, at this time. The yellow kid that was seen as, we really need to Christianize and help these poor Cubans who are being controlled by the Spanish. Here's some images. If you look here, this was actually published in one of the Pulitzer or Hertz newspapers. They would draw pictures saying this is what the senators saw when they went there. And here's a political cartoon of Pulitzer and Hertz really pushing for war, and of course they're dressed in the yellow kid outfits. But what really gets the United States into the war was the sinking of the USS Maine. So what happens is that there was kind of a riot in Havana, in the Havana Harbor, and America sends the USS Maine to the Havana Harbor in order to protect business interests down there. And it's basically just sitting in the harbor protecting those business interests, and all of a sudden it explodes. And so this mysterious explosion happens, and of course the yellow journalists are going to push for this to be, accuse Spain of this. And so we create a blockade, not allowing Spanish ships to come in. So there are 260 Americans actually die in this explosion. It later turns out that this was an accidental explosion that's uncovered later. But, by that time we're already in the war with Spain. But this is really what causes it. So the Spanish-American War, it begins and ends in 1898, and I'll explain this here in just a minute. But in April 21st, America creates a blockade into the colonies, any kind of Spanish ships coming in. So Spain really had no other choice but to obviously declare war. This between the United States and Spain. This is a very short war. It lasts like literally 4 months of firing. There's very few casualties and losses. 345 were killed and 2,500 killed by disease, which is really common. Okay, and so the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named Hayes, called this the splendid little war because it literally was a little war, and we got everything we wanted. We got a lot out of this war. So this kind of gives you a timeline. I like this timeline. It really shows you, February 1898 is when the sinking of the Maine happens. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 in December officially ends the war, but the ceasefire happens in August of 1898. So really, in April is when the war starts. So very little time that this war actually happens. Okay, but major effects. Here's a timeline, kind of a map timeline if you're interested in that, of the war itself. You can see that most of the fighting happens in the southern part of Cuba. And this battle is going to be really important, the Battle of San Juan Hill. And the reason for that is because that's where Teddy Roosevelt really climbs to political fame, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Okay, so what are the big outcomes of the war? Because the war itself, kind of unimpressive, right? A 4-month war. But again, Teddy Roosevelt, I'll show you an image of him in the Rough Riders. Yes, we talked about him when we were talking about the progressive presidents. He is going to really climb to fame. He was already a politician in New York, but he volunteered to join this war because he was so outraged at what was happening with the Cubans. And so he leads a group of very wealthy cavalry officers known as the Rough Riders, and leads a very famous battle known as the Battle of San Juan. He's so famous by this that McKinley, when he runs for president again in 1900, has Teddy Roosevelt, even though he's a Republican. He's a Republican, but his policies were very, very different than McKinley's. He has him as his vice president. And interestingly enough, McKinley's assassinated at the beginning of his second term in 1901, and that's how Teddy Roosevelt became president. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing just a little bit, but Cuba does not become a territory of the United States. We didn't want to look greedy, so it becomes what's known as a protectorate, meaning we basically have a major sphere of influence over Cuba itself. And we kind of forced Cuba into creating what's known as the Platt Amendment, which reserve the right, and this is where the sphere of influence comes into play, for American troops to be stationed there and to intervene anytime we felt that we needed to intervene. It also established Guantanamo Bay. Now, you might know Guantanamo Bay. That was recently closed down because of all kinds of torture that was happening to various suspected Muslim extremists there in the 2000s. But that's when we opened Guantanamo Bay as a naval base, and we rented it from them. But, yeah, it didn't end until recently. See, here's an image of Teddy Roosevelt in the Rough Riders, and here's Teddy right here. Like I said, really kind of, big claim to fame there at that time. So, Treaty of Paris, 1898, Spain not only gives up Cuba, but also cedes Puerto Rico. That's how we got Puerto Rico, okay, which is still a territory of the United States. That's how we got Guam. Guam is still a territory of the United States. And America actually had the Philippines as its own territory for a long time, until the 1940s. We pay Spain $20 million for this, okay? But this last point is really going to lead to a major problem that you've probably never heard about, and we'll talk about here in a minute. But here's a map that shows the territories just so you can see where they are. So, here are the Hawaiian Islands, okay, so that gives you an idea of where Hawaii was, the Philippines and Guam, Cuba and Puerto Rico. So this kind of gives you an idea, American Samoa, all of these islands that we begin to really colonize and take over during this time period. Okay, so I told you that the issue of the Philippines was going to lead to a major war, actually, it was longer and a lot more deaths than the actual Spanish-American War. And this was a war between the Filipinos and the Americans. Now, what happened was the Filipinos during the Spanish-American War joined American forces in the Philippines because they thought, well, I'm going to get my freedom and independence just like Cuba is going to. So that is what they did. They joined out with that intention. Unfortunately for the Filipinos, that's not what Americans did. They actually took it over. So they went from one colonizer, the Spanish, to the American colonizers. So obviously this is going to make them pretty upset, right? And as a matter of fact, there was a man named Emilio Anguialdo, and he's going to lead a major rebellion against the Americans and lead this war. Now, this war is what's going to really create the friction in the United States itself on whether or not we should even be involved in any kind of imperialism. And that's because all kinds of atrocities were reported, rapes, torture, mass executions of the Filipino people. And so this is what's going to cause the huge anti-imperialist league that's going to form in the United States because of it. And this is really going to be where the debate is centered, okay? So again, there's going to be a major debates in the United States, the pro-imperialist versus the anti-imperialist. The pro-imperialists say, hey, we need the economic growth. We need to compete with European empires. The Western frontier, it's closed. We're done, right? We can't grow anymore. Plus, there's this whole thing of white man's burden. We have to Christianize them, right? The anti-imperialists believe that how can we become imperializers when we were the colonies once ourselves? That goes against the American democracy. They believed in isolationism, which was a tradition that Washington put forth in his farewell address. Okay, they formed the Anti-Imperialist League, and notice that I have both racial arguments on both sides, and that's because the pro-imperialists thought, well, we need to make these races better, and there were anti-imperialists that were racist too. They said we don't want our races to mix. So you have these two very different ideas, but what we have is a major debate over whether or not imperialism should really happen. Okay, also during this time, just like we had the progressive presidents, we have three different ideas on how imperialism should take place and if imperialism should take place by these three presidents in the early 20th century, Teddy, Taft, and Wilson. Okay, Wilson's policy is going to be really important, by the way, because it's going to lead us right into World War I, which is our next discussion. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt actually takes his ideology from an African proverb known as speak softly and carry a big stick. Essentially, try to negotiate, and if that doesn't work, take it by force. And that's really the way Teddy really operated. He adopts an idea, and the idea that we need to become like the police power of the Western Hemisphere. This adds on to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and this idea is that not only do we not want you to come here, but we're going to be the main constable of the Western Hemisphere. If there's any issues between anybody and between Europe and the Western world, we're the ones that negotiate it. Okay, that was called the Roosevelt Corollary. So he has this idea of this big stick diplomacy, which comes from speak softly and carry a big stick, right? That we will use force if necessary to try to make people succumb to what we want them to do. This is kind of like the negative side, at least I see, of Teddy. I thought Teddy was a great president, but this is kind of seen as the not so perfect side of Teddy. He really wanted to civilize other nations. Okay, so here's just lots of political cartoons of Teddy during this time, but this is a really famous one. This shows how we're the big stick policy and how he's really controlling everything. He's the debt collector. He's everything, right? Policing it. Here's another political cartoon of him as the world constable arbitration and these European countries trying to talk. And look how backwards they look, right? This new diplomacy basically force everybody to do what they want them to do. Okay, one of the most famous examples of this big stick diplomacy was the Panama Canal. So basically, I'm going to give you the rundown, the 5-second description here on what happened with the Panama Canal. But essentially, this was an area that most Europeans wanted built. They wanted, because it was an isthmus at the time, and northern and southern America, and they wanted that cut. they wanted a canal built, but the Panamanians really refused to do this. And really, the Colombians were the ones that controlled Panama at that time. It was actually part of Colombia. But what happens is that the Panamanians begin to want a revolution and separate from Colombia, and Teddy intervenes, being the world constable, right, or the Western Hemisphere constable. So what happens is Teddy brings down American naval ships down to the area of the Panama Canal in the bay and basically points naval guns at Colombia and says, you need to give the Panamanians their independence. And they're like, well, we don't want to fight you, America. And so they give Panama their independence. And then America turns to Panama and said, okay, if you want to keep your independence, if you want us to stay here and protect you, build that canal. And that's essentially how the canal was built, okay? So we kind of forced Panama into building that canal. Now, we rented it from them, but we controlled that canal until 1999. That's a long time, right? There's a great video clip on the Panama Canal and Teddy. I encourage you to watch it. That one's a good one, too. Okay, so this kind of shows you the importance of the Panama Canal economically. Take a look at the difference. With the Panama Canal built, look at the time it cuts. As going around the southern tip of South America and how much time. So you can imagine shipping cost and travel, how much that would save economically for the United States and for other countries for that matter, because we literally charge people to go through the Panama Canal. Okay, and so this kind of gives you a little timeline and shows you a map of all the times the United States was involved. Not all of them, but most of the times they became a protectorate. We controlled situations. Here's the Panamanian situation. All kinds of debt collections or anything. The United States was heavily involved in the business of the western part of in Southern and Central America, which is going to plant the seeds for a little bit of anger by the people in Central and Southern America against the United States, but it's really going to continue during the Cold War, which we'll talk about, when America was heavily involved with stomping out any regime that might even think about being a communist. Okay, so the next president was President Taft, and President Taft believed in something known as dollar diplomacy. He believed that the real way to control the southern territories was by making businesses invest in them instead of using force, encouraging American businesses to do this. Okay, he's also going to push more for the open door policy, which was already a thing with China, but he's really focused on the financial part of imperialism. He does believe in imperialism, but he believes not so much in the force like Teddy does, but in what's known as dollar diplomacy. And of course, there's his, the pen is mightier than the sword kind of idea, and this is Taft. Okay, Wilson is not an imperialist. He's an anti-imperialist. And this is going to drive most of his beliefs. And actually, he was very much an isolationist. He campaigns in 1916. He kept us out of war as his second term. And so he doesn't believe that we should be involved in any kind of imperialism. He actually pushes a lot towards giving these countries their autonomy. He believes that everybody should control their own destiny. But he does not believe in anything but democracy. And if he sees anything like that, he will support any country as long as they were supporting like this democratic idea. He believed that, nations should really be self-governing. Okay, and here's an image of of Wilson, the political cartoon, last one here. So basically, this is School by Wilson. We will have no empathy for those who seize the power of government to advance their own personal interests, talking to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Mexico over there. So it's kind of a funny political cartoon. Okay, that's it. This is going to lead us right into talking about why we get involved in World War I and America's role in World War I, and that will be our next video clip.